Dow Chemical, the empire built on bleach and controversy. In 1897, a young chemistry graduate named Herbert Dow looked at a brine well in Midland, Michigan, and saw something nobody else could see. While others saw worthless salt water, Dow saw pure profit floating in those mineral-rich depths. With just $1,200 and a revolutionary electrolytic process he'd developed, Dow founded what would become one of the world's largest chemical empires. The Dow Chemical Company started with a simple mission: extract bromine from brine more efficiently than anyone else. But Herbert Dow wasn't just building a chemical company. He was constructing an industrial fortress that would survive 2 world wars, countless environmental scandals, and economic upheavals that destroyed lesser corporations. Today, Dow operates in 31 countries with annual revenues exceeding $50 billion, employing nearly 37,000 people worldwide. Yet this empire built on innovation carries shadows that stretch from the killing fields of Vietnam to the industrial disaster zones of India, making it one of the most simultaneously celebrated and controversial corporations in American history. The genius of Herbert Dow lay not just in chemistry, but in industrial warfare. When German bromine cartels attempted to crush his fledgling company by flooding the American market with cheap imports, Dow didn't retreat. Instead, he turned the tables in a move so audacious it became a Harvard Business School case study. Dow bought up all the German bromine being dumped in America, then shipped it to Europe, and sold it at a massive profit in the Germans' own backyard. The cartel, bleeding money on both sides of the Atlantic, eventually surrendered and agreed to divide global markets with the upstart American company. This wasn't just a business victory, it was a declaration that American chemical innovation could compete with and defeat the established European powers. By 1900, Dow had expanded beyond bromine into chlorine production, discovering that the same electrolytic process could extract multiple valuable chemicals from Michigan's underground brine deposits. The company's early motto, "If you can't beat them, join them, then beat them," perfectly captured Herbert Dow's philosophy of competitive destruction. World War I transformed Dow from a regional chemical company into a global industrial powerhouse. When the war cut off German chemical supplies to America, Dow stepped into the vacuum with stunning efficiency. The company began producing synthetic dyes, pharmaceuticals, and industrial chemicals that had previously been imported exclusively from Germany. Herbert Dow proved that American industry could replace German chemistry almost overnight, a lesson that wouldn't be forgotten when the next World War arrived. By 1918, Dow's annual sales had exploded from $800,000 to over $4 million. The company had discovered the fundamental truth that would drive its growth for the next century. War and conflict created massive chemical demand, and Dow would be ready to supply whatever the military needed. More importantly, Dow established the integrated production model that became its signature advantage. Instead of buying raw materials from suppliers, Dow created entire chemical chains within single facilities, where the waste products of one process became the raw materials for another. This integration gave Dow cost advantages that competitors couldn't match and flexibility that allowed rapid adaptation to changing market demands. The 1920s and 1930s saw Dow's expansion into consumer products that would make the company a household name, though few consumers realized they were buying from a chemical giant. Dow began producing iodine for medical applications, developing the process that made iodized salt possible and virtually eliminating thyroid disease in America. The company moved into magnesium production, creating ultra-lightweight metals that revolutionized aviation and automotive manufacturing. But Dow's most significant innovation during this period was synthetic phenol, the building block for plastics, synthetic rubber, and countless industrial chemicals. When Herbert Dow died in 1930, he left behind a company generating over $15 million annually and positioned to dominate multiple chemical markets. His son Willard Dow assumed control and pushed the company into even more aggressive expansion, establishing international operations and developing the research laboratories that would make Dow an innovation powerhouse. Under Willard's leadership, Dow pioneered polystyrene plastics, synthetic rubber, and agricultural chemicals that would reshape entire industries. World War II elevated Dow into the ranks of America's most strategically important corporations, though this prominence came with moral complexities that haunt the company to this day. Dow became a primary supplier of magnesium for aircraft production, synthetic rubber for military vehicles, and various chemicals for munitions manufacturing. The company's production facilities operated at maximum capacity, with workers laboring around the clock to meet military demands. Dow's synthetic rubber program alone was worth over $100 million, helping America overcome the Japanese blockade of natural rubber supplies from Southeast Asia. But Dow's wartime contracts also included producing materials for classified weapons programs, establishing patterns of military cooperation that would later entangle the company in some of America's most controversial foreign interventions. The war years saw Dow's annual revenues explode to over $200 million by 1945, transforming it from a regional chemical company into one of America's largest industrial corporations. More significantly, the war convinced Dow's leadership that the company's future lay in becoming indispensable to American military and industrial power, a strategy that would drive both spectacular growth and devastating controversies. The post-war chemical boom turned Dow into a plastics and synthetic materials empire that touched every aspect of American life. Dow introduced Styrofoam insulation in 1946, creating an entirely new construction material that became standard in American building. The company pioneered Saran wrap in the early 1950s, revolutionizing food storage and creating one of the most recognizable consumer brands in history. Dow's research laboratories developed synthetic fabrics, industrial adhesives, agricultural pesticides, and pharmaceutical chemicals that generated billions in revenue while establishing Dow as America's most innovative chemical company. By 1960, Dow's annual sales exceeded $1 billion, making it one of only a handful of American corporations to reach that milestone. The company employed over 30,000 people and operated manufacturing facilities across the United States and in 12 foreign countries. But this explosive growth came with environmental costs that Dow's leadership either ignored or actively concealed. Chemical waste from Dow facilities contaminated groundwater, rivers, and soil across multiple states, while workers were exposed to toxic substances without adequate protection or warning. The Vietnam War era brought Dow its greatest profits and most enduring infamy through the production of Agent Orange, the chemical defoliant that became synonymous with American military excess. Dow was the primary contractor for producing Agent Orange under military specifications, manufacturing millions of gallons of the herbicide between 1965 and 1969. The military contract was worth over $200 million and represented a significant portion of Dow's revenue during the peak Vietnam years. However, Dow's own research had identified the presence of dioxin contamination in Agent Orange as early as 1965. Yet the company continued production without informing military or government officials about the toxic risks. When anti-war protesters began targeting Dow directly, staging demonstrations at the company's headquarters and recruitment events, Dow found itself at the center of America's most divisive foreign conflict. The company's executives made the calculated decision that military contracts were more valuable than public relations, a choice that would cost Dow billions in eventual legal settlements and permanent damage to its corporate reputation. Dow's production of Agent Orange exposed millions of Vietnamese civilians and American veterans to dioxin poisoning, creating health problems that persist decades later and legal liabilities that continue to impact the company's finances. The 1970s and 1980s forced Dow to confront the environmental and legal consequences of decades of chemical production, while simultaneously expanding into new markets that would sustain future growth. The creation of the Environmental Protection Agency in 1970 brought federal regulation to chemical manufacturing for the first time, forcing Dow to spend hundreds of millions of dollars on pollution control equipment and environmental cleanup programs. Dow facilities in Michigan, Texas, and Louisiana were identified as major sources of groundwater contamination, requiring extensive remediation efforts that took decades to complete. The company faced its first major product liability lawsuits related to Agent Orange exposure, beginning legal battles that would eventually cost Dow over $3 billion in settlements and judgments. Yet Dow's response to environmental pressure demonstrated the adaptability that had characterized the company since Herbert Dow's era. The company invested heavily in developing more environmentally friendly production processes, created new chemical products with reduced toxicity, and established environmental research programs that became industry models. More importantly, Dow diversified into specialty chemicals, advanced materials, and biotechnology products that offered higher profit margins and reduced environmental risks compared to basic chemical manufacturing. The 1990s and early 2000s marked Dow's transformation from a traditional chemical manufacturer into a global materials science corporation, though this evolution was complicated by the acquisition of Union Carbide and its devastating legacy from the Bhopal disaster. In 2001, Dow acquired Union Carbide for over $11 billion, instantly inheriting legal liabilities from the 1984 Bhopal gas leak that killed thousands of Indian civilians and injured hundreds of thousands more. The acquisition made business sense because it gave Dow access to Union Carbide's advanced polymer technologies and global manufacturing networks, but it also saddled Dow with moral and legal responsibilities that continue to generate controversy. Dow's leadership argued that Union Carbide's liabilities were resolved through previous legal settlements, but critics accused the company of using corporate restructuring to avoid accountability for industrial disasters. Despite these complications, the Union Carbide acquisition positioned Dow as the world's largest producer of plastic resins, synthetic rubbers, and industrial chemicals, with operations spanning 6 continents and revenues exceeding $40 billion annually. The early 2000s also saw Dow's expansion into agricultural biotechnology through partnerships with companies like Monsanto, developing genetically modified crops and advanced pesticides that sparked new controversies about corporate control over food production. The 2008 financial crisis and subsequent decade tested Dow's resilience while forcing another strategic transformation that would define the company's modern identity. Dow's revenues dropped by over 20% during the recession as construction and automotive demand collapsed, forcing massive cost-cutting measures, including the elimination of over 5,000 jobs worldwide. However, the crisis also created opportunities for Dow to acquire distressed competitors and consolidate market share in key chemical sectors. The company's 2017 merger with DuPont, valued at $130 billion, created the world's largest chemical corporation before immediately splitting into 3 separate companies focused on agriculture, materials science, and specialty products. This restructuring allowed Dow to shed lower-margin commodity chemical businesses while concentrating on high-value materials for electronics, automotive, and construction applications. Today's Dow generates over $50 billion in annual revenue with profit margins significantly higher than the traditional chemical industry average. The company has successfully repositioned itself as a materials innovation leader, developing advanced plastics for electric vehicle batteries, sustainable packaging materials, and construction products that reduce building energy consumption. Yet Dow's legacy issues persist, with ongoing legal battles over environmental contamination, product liability claims related to various chemical exposures, and international disputes over historical disasters like Bhopal. The empire Herbert Dow built from Michigan brine has survived over a century of wars, environmental disasters, economic upheavals, and technological revolutions to become one of the world's most enduring industrial corporations. Dow's success demonstrates how innovative chemistry, aggressive competition, and strategic adaptation can create lasting corporate power even in the face of massive controversies and changing market conditions. The company's evolution from a small bromine producer to a global materials science leader illustrates the fundamental principle that empire builders must continuously reinvent their businesses while leveraging core competencies across multiple market cycles. Dow's willingness to embrace military contracts during wartime, expand internationally during periods of American global dominance, and adapt to environmental regulation when public pressure became irresistible, shows how successful corporations must balance profit maximization with social and political realities. However, Dow's story also reveals the long-term costs of prioritizing growth over responsibility, as the company continues to pay billions in legal settlements and remediation costs for decisions made decades ago. The Agent Orange legacy, environmental contamination, and industrial disasters like Bhopal represent permanent shadows on Dow's reputation that no amount of corporate restructuring can completely eliminate. Modern Dow operates in a world where environmental sustainability, corporate social responsibility, and stakeholder capitalism have become business imperatives rather than optional considerations. The company's current focus on sustainable materials, circular economy principles, and carbon reduction represents both a genuine strategic evolution and a recognition that 21st century empire building requires different approaches than those that built Dow's original chemical fortress. Whether Dow can maintain its industrial dominance while satisfying modern expectations for corporate responsibility will determine if this empire can survive another century of technological disruption and social change.